Rosa Johnson, an elderly woman from Brooklyn, fought to reclaim her land after the city took it without warning or compensation. With no lawyer, she bravely represented herself in court, challenging a powerful legal team. Despite the odds, her simple truth justice is about human dignity resonated with the judge. Though the city appealed, hoping to overturn her victory, Rosa stood strong, supported by her community. In the end, the judge upheld his decision, recognizing the human side of justice. Rosa's fight proved that even the powerless can make a difference, showing the world that justice isn't just in the law, it's in the people. The courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, was packed that morning. The air was thick with the usual tension, lawyers flipping through legal documents, the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished floors, and hushed voices bouncing off the high, cold stone walls. It was a typical day with nothing extraordinary expected. People came to witness what seemed to be just another minor case, a procedural matter that would be resolved quickly. The buzz in the room was casual, a mix of brief exchanges and last-minute preparations. But none of them knew that this would be the day that would shake their perception of justice forever. The judge, Albert Cunningham, a man well into his 60s, with sharp features and gray hair, walked into the room. He exuded authority with every step, his movements deliberate, his robes flowing behind him like the weight of his own power. The murmurs ceased immediately as his gaze swept across the room. His reputation as a strict, no-nonsense judge preceded him. He was known for his cold demeanor, his unwavering belief in the law, and his absolute intolerance for mistakes. If you were in his courtroom, you followed the rules or you faced his wrath. No exceptions. He settled into his chair with the precision of a man who had been in this position for far too long. "Next case," he announced in his deep, commanding voice. The room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath as the next name was read. Rosa Johnson versus the City of Brooklyn. A few puzzled glances passed among the lawyers. This was a case no one had expected to be particularly noteworthy. It seemed too ordinary, too small. But the name, Rosa Johnson, resonated differently with the few who had heard of her before, though they didn't yet understand why. As the clerk called out the case, the eyes of the room shifted. They followed the frail figure of a woman who stood up at the back. She wasn't like the others in the room. She wasn't dressed in a suit, nor did she carry the air of someone accustomed to such places. Instead, she walked slowly, but with unwavering determination. The shuffle of her feet on the wooden floor echoed in the silent room. Rosa Johnson, an elderly black woman with skin the color of worn leather, moved toward the front of the room. Her face was lined with the years of hard work and pain, her eyes calm but filled with a wisdom earned through a lifetime of suffering. She wore a faded skirt, a simple blouse, and an old scarf wrapped around her head. Her clothes, while modest, told the story of someone who had worked long hours under the hot sun, fighting to survive in a world that rarely offered her a fare. Chance. As she walked to the front, murmurs rippled through the room. Lawyers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. A few snickered quietly. Rosa looked fragile, unimportant to them, a simple woman, likely confused, caught in a system far beyond her reach. It was a judgment they would soon regret. Rosa's. Every step carried a quiet strength, a resolve that no one in the room could yet comprehend. As she stood at the front, waiting for the proceedings to begin, the silence deepened. The judge's cold eyes scanned her for a moment before he spoke, his voice laced with skepticism. "You are the plaintiff?" His words were sharp, disbelieving. "Yes." "Your Honor," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "My name is Rosa Johnson, and I have come to speak for what is right." A few faint snickers echoed from the back, but Rosa remained calm, her eyes never leaving the judge. The energy in the room shifted slightly. There was something in her that commanded attention, something beyond the old woman's unassuming appearance. Even the judge, with all his years of experience and his towering reputation, couldn't help but feel a slight disturbance in the air. The room waited for the case to begin, but something told them that today, Brooklyn's justice system would face a challenge it never expected. The room was dead silent, the tension thickening with each passing second as Judge Albert Cunningham fixed his gaze on Rosa. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom were trained on the elderly woman standing so resolutely before him. The atmosphere felt like a simmering pot waiting to boil over. For a moment, it almost seemed as if the judge was measuring her, trying to assess the depth of her resolve. Judge Cunningham was a man of reputation. His courtroom was a place where laws were interpreted with precision, where emotions were seen as distractions, and where only the cold, hard truth of written statutes mattered. He had built a career on his unyielding adherence to the letter of the law. No exceptions. He had no tolerance for mistakes, for those who couldn't keep up with the pace of the justice system. And Rosa Johnson, with her worn clothes, unrefined presence, and undeniable aura of defiance, was something he couldn't quite place. His eyebrows knitted together, and his gaze deepened with the kind of scrutiny that made even the most hardened criminals tremble. His voice rang out, steady and commanding, yet carrying a coldness that could freeze the very air between them. "You have no lawyer, Mrs. Johnson. Is that correct?" His words were clipped, each syllable pronounced with precision, as though you are already preparing to dismiss the case. "Yes, Your Honor," Rosa replied softly, unfazed by his tone. "No one would take my case." The room stirred at this. There was an uncomfortable shuffle in the seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. A woman, untrained in the ways of the law, unrepresented, dared to take on the system? It was an absurdity to them. But to Rosa, it was the only option she had left. "They told me I was wasting my time," she continued, her voice steady but edged with the faintest trace of hurt. "They told me my case wasn't worth anything, that I wouldn't win. But that wasn't why I came. I came to speak the truth, Your Honor. I came to make sure someone hears me, someone listens." The murmurs grew louder now, rippling through the crowd. Rosa's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of quiet defiance. Judge Cunningham's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, something like contempt flickered in his gaze. "This is a courtroom, Mrs. Johnson. This is not a place for speeches. You need evidence. You need facts. You need a lawyer." His voice grew harsher, more dismissive. "Without them, you're wasting my time, and everyone else's. So unless you have something solid to present, I suggest you sit down." A hush fell over the room. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, as if marking the slow passage of time. Rosa's shoulders, once slumped under the weight of a life filled with hardships, now seemed to straighten ever so slightly. Her eyes met the judge's, and for a moment the entire room seemed to fade away. There was something in her gaze, something profound, like she was carrying the weight of history itself. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice soft but unwavering, "I didn't come here for the law. I didn't come here for your judgment. I came because I want you to hear me. Hear what happened to me, to my land, to my family. Hear what they did to us." Her words were quiet but insistent. She didn't shout, didn't demand attention. She simply spoke the truth, as if the simple act of speaking could carve a path through the layers of bureaucracy that had buried her life. The judge's hands tightened around the edge of his bench, his jaw setting in irritation. But Rosa wasn't finished. No, she had just begun. "I'm not asking for money, Your Honor," she continued, her voice growing in strength. "I don't want compensation. I just want someone to hear that what was done to me wasn't right. It wasn't fair. They took everything without even a second thought. and now I'm left with nothing except this truth. Her words hit harder than any legal argument could. They pierced through the formalities of the courtroom, slicing through the walls of indifference that had been built up over the years. For a brief moment, even Judge Cunningham felt it. He felt a prickle of discomfort in the pit of his stomach, as though he, too, had been swept up in the current of her pain. He immediately recoiled, his stern expression returning, and he hit a gavel against the wood of his bench with a sharp crack. "This is not a place for personal grievances," he snapped, his tone cutting through her words like a blade. "If you have no evidence, then I have no reason to continue wasting my time on this." But Rosa, though shaken by his coldness, didn't back down. She stood firm, as if her very life depended on her voice being heard. "You're right, Judge," she said, nodding slowly. "I don't have what you call official evidence, but I have something far more important. I have a memory." The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. The judge's gaze grew darker, and he leaned forward, his interest piqued despite himself. "You have a memory?" he repeated, as though the idea was foreign to him. Rosa nodded, reaching into the depths of her worn bag. She pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, the edges frayed from years of handling. It looked like it had been through more than its fair share of hardships, much like its owner. "Here are the dates," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she held the book out to the judge. "The names, the signatures, the records. They told me it was all worthless, but I've kept them anyway, because these are my memories, and I believe they're just as important as any legal document you might hold in your hands." The room was unnervingly still. Even the lawyers, who had been whispering among themselves, grew quiet. Rosa's simple words seemed to hang in the air, challenging the entire system to recognize something it often dismissed: human experience, human truth. Judge Cunningham, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, felt a strange shift in the room. His eyes flickered to the notebook in her hands, then to her face. For a moment there was a crack in his usual composure. He motioned to the court clerk. "Let her speak. Let's hear this evidence she's referring to." The clerk handed Rosa a microphone, and she began to read, her voice steady but filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "March 3rd, 2014, she read aloud, the words clear despite the shakiness in her hands. "Spoke with engineer Medina. He promised me the land wouldn't be touched. He swore on his word that nothing would happen to it. His signature is here." The judge squinted at the pages she presented. His mind raced through the technicalities of legal proceedings. But there was something about the way Rosa spoke about the matter-of-fact tone she used, as if she were recounting a history that had been written in her soul, not on paper, that made him pause. "October 12th, 2018, Rosa continued, voice steady but carrying the weight of the years. "They came with machines. They didn't have any order or papers. I asked them to stop, but they just laughed and told me to leave. They said the mayor had ordered it." She flipped to the next page, the sound of the paper crisp in the quiet room. "April 20th, 2020. It was raining. My garden was gone. I sat in the dirt, staring at what was left of my home. I thought of Roberto, my late husband, and how he would never have let this happen. If he had still been here, none of this would have happened." The words were simple, raw, honest, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. The weight of a woman who had lost everything except her dignity. The judge, his hand still gripping the edge of his bench, sat motionless. The room was silent, save for the soft sounds of Rosa's voice as she spoke of loss, of injustice, of a battle that had been fought quietly for years. Rosa closed the notebook and placed it gently on the table before the judge. She didn't expect him to suddenly side with her or to declare her the victor in this battle. But in that moment, she had done something more important than anything a legal precedent could offer. She had forced them all to listen, and she knew that was the first step toward justice. The silence in the room grew thicker, suffocating. It was as though every person in that courtroom had been pulled into Rosa's words, and for the first time, they couldn't look away. The judge remained still, his eyes flickering over the crumbling pages of the notebook she had handed him. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl. Outside the window, the busy streets of Brooklyn continued their relentless march, but in this small, cold courtroom, everything felt suspended, everything but the weight of Rosa's truth. She stood there, unmoved by the stares, the skepticism, and even the harshness of the judge. To her, this moment was not about winning a case. It was about being heard, being seen, no matter how small or insignificant she had been made to feel. No one, not even the city that had stolen her land, could take that away from her. For the first time in his career, Judge Cunningham felt his own certainty wavering. He had dealt with criminals, with thieves, with liars who tried to manipulate the law. But Rosa was different. She wasn't here to twist the truth to her advantage. She was here because she had no other choice. The judge's fingers lingered on the pages of the old notebook, his eyes narrowing as he read. There was something about the worn edges, the faded ink, the dates that seemed to carve a history into his mind that even the finest legal documents couldn't replicate. He glanced back up at Rosa, who stood still, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wasn't looking for sympathy, nor did she demand anyone's approval. She was simply waiting for him to acknowledge her pain, her loss, her right to speak. After a long moment, Cunningham's voice broke through the thick silence. His tone was clipped, but there was an unmistakable hint of doubt creeping into his words. "Your records," he began slowly, "are unconventional. There is no formal documentation to back up your claims. These dates, these names without supporting evidence, they hold no weight in this court." His eyes scanned the room, as if looking for someone to back him up, someone to reinforce the familiar, cold logic of the law. But no one spoke. Not even the other lawyers dared to challenge the stillness. Rosa tilted her head slightly, her face betraying no anger, no frustration. Instead, there was only quiet resolve. "I know, Your Honor," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't have anything but my memory, but that's all I've had left. I didn't write these things down because I expected to be in this room, fighting for my life. I wrote them down because I was afraid I might forget. I wrote them because I needed to remember that they stole my past. And when no one else would listen, I had to keep track of it, even if it was just for me." The room seemed to hold its breath, hanging on her every word. Even Judge Cunningham seemed momentarily unsettled. He rubbed his forehead with his fingers, his gaze shifting from Rosa's face to the pages in front of him. The quiet tension in the room was broken only by the sound of the courtroom door creaking open, and a young man stepped inside. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came only with privilege. His name was Andrew Wallace, the assistant city attorney, and it was clear from the way he strutted into the room that he had little respect for anyone who wasn't part of the established order. "Your Honor," Andrew began, his voice oozing with arrogance, "with all due respect, I believe we're wasting time here. This is an open and shut case. There is no formal evidence, no valid legal claim. My client, the city of Brooklyn, acted within its rights when it seized the property. There is no question about it." His gaze flicked to Rosa with disdain, as though he were addressing a beggar rather than a woman seeking justice. Rosa didn't flinch at the condescension in his voice. Instead, she looked up at him with an intensity that seemed to make the air in the room crackle. "I'm not here to fight over your laws, young man," she said, her tone firm but calm. "I'm here to make you listen. And maybe, just maybe, here's something you didn't think was important." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unapologetic. It was a moment of power quiet, but undeniable, that had the entire room suspended. In a collective breath, Andrew sneered, clearly impatient with her defiance. "Listen? What do you expect us to listen to? Your memories? This isn't a courtroom for stories, ma'am. This is a place for evidence. I'm afraid your memories won't stand up to the scrutiny of the law." Rosa took a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I don't expect you to understand," she said quietly, "but I will tell you this. Memories are what make us. Without them, we're just dust. I may not have the papers you want, but I have the truth. And that's something I don't need your approval for." The room was silent once again. Rosa's words, so simple, so raw, had left Andrew Wallace speechless. For a brief moment, even Judge Cunningham couldn't find the words to break the stillness that had taken over the courtroom. Andrew cleared his throat and straightened his tie, his face flushed with embarrassment. He quickly shuffled through his papers and turned his attention back to the judge. "Your Honor," but Cunningham interrupted him, his voice cold but surprisingly firm. "Enough." The authority in his voice shut Andrew down immediately. The young attorney's mouth snapped shut, his eyes wide with disbelief. No one interrupted Cunningham, no one. The judge took a deep breath, as if considering something long buried. He turned his gaze back to Rosa, whose expression hadn't changed. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't pleading. She was simply present in her truth, in her pain. "I will review the city's records myself," Cunningham said, his tone not as harsh as it had been before. "And I will review the claims that have been made here today. This is not over." Rosa nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't expect a miracle. She didn't expect Cunningham to side with her, or to rule in her favor. But this, the acknowledgement of her voice, the promise to look deeper than the surface, was enough. For now, it was enough. And for the first time in years, Rosa Johnson felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. The courtroom was an arena of silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Albert Cunningham sat at his bench, his hand resting on the stack of documents that had been placed in front of him. His usually unshakable confidence was now a distant memory. For the first time in his long career, he found himself questioning everything he had stood for: the rigid laws, the ironclad rules, the belief that justice was something that could only be defined by legal statutes and hard evidence. In the moments after Rosa had spoken, something within him had shifted, but he wasn't ready to admit it, even to himself. He had listened to countless cases, had presided over murders, robberies, and frauds, but never had he felt so unsettled. Rosa wasn't just asking for compensation. She wasn't demanding the city's money or property. She was asking for recognition. She was asking for the truth to be heard. But could that be enough? Could truth alone stand up in a court of law? Was it right to base a judgment on something as intangible as memory? The judge rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. He had always prided himself on being unyielding, on upholding the law without bias, without sentiment. But what Rosa had brought into his courtroom was something far deeper than law. It was humanity itself. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for the weight of an elderly woman, alone in her fight, standing before him and challenging everything he had believed in. Across the room, Rosa sat silently, her hands folded. In her lap, she wasn't fidgeting, wasn't nervously awaiting his decision. She had already said everything she needed to say. She had given her truth. Now, all she could do was wait for him to decide whether he would let her voice echo in the halls of Justice or crush it beneath the weight of the system. Andrew Wallace, the young assistant city attorney, paced near the back of the room, growing more agitated with each passing second. He couldn't understand why Judge Cunningham had not already dismissed the case. It was clear there was no evidence, no formal records, nothing but an old woman's memories. What was there to deliberate? Your Honor, Wallace finally said, his voice sharp with frustration. With all due respect, there is nothing here to suggest that this case has any merit. There are no formal documents, no registered titles, no witnesses who can testify to the legitimacy of this land claim. If we start entertaining claims like this, the entire system will fall apart. Cunningham's gaze shifted to the young attorney. Wallace's words echoed with the cold certainty that had guided him through his years on the bench. They were words he had told himself 1,000 times in similar situations. But this time, they didn't sit right. Not today. I've heard your argument, Mr. Wallace, Cunningham said, his voice steady, but tinged with something unfamiliar, a hesitation. And you're right about the law. The law requires evidence. The law requires documentation. He paused, his gaze flickering to the old notebook Rosa had placed on the table. But the law is not the only thing at play here. Wallace's brow furrowed. He could see Cunningham was wavering, and it unnerved him. The judge had always been a man who prided himself on his cold logic, his unwavering commitment to the law. To see him even briefly question that, it was unsettling. I am reviewing the records, Mr. Wallace, Cunningham continued, and I expect you to do the same. There are things here that go beyond the documents. This case, whatever it turns out to be, is not just about property law. His eyes locked onto Rosa's. This is about something more. Something ... human. Rosa did not flinch. She simply nodded, the slightest flicker of relief in her chest. She wasn't sure if the judge would rule in her favor, but in this moment, he had done something far more valuable. He had given her the dignity of being heard. Wallace's face tightened, his lips curling in disbelief. Your Honor, you cannot seriously. I believe I can, Cunningham interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. This court is in recess. We will resume tomorrow. I will review the city's records and assess this case. In the meantime, I expect both parties to prepare their final statements. The gavel slammed down with finality, echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Rosa stood to leave, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. She had done what she came to do. Now, all she had to do was wait. But as she gathered her things and turned to leave, she felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder. She looked up to see a woman standing there, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose. It was someone Rosa didn't know, someone who had been quietly watching from the back of the room. I just wanted to say, the woman said, her voice low and steady, you were brave. And you were right. They can't take your memories. They can't take your truth. Rosa's eyes softened as she met the woman's gaze. She smiled, a quiet, weary smile, the kind that said more than words ever could. Thank you, she replied. Simply. The woman nodded and stepped away, leaving Rosa standing there in the now empty courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Cunningham would truly side with her, or if she would walk out of this courtroom with nothing but more loss. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The power of her own voice. The courtroom was filled with a heavy anticipation. The murmur of voices had died down completely, replaced by the quiet rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. Everyone in the room knew something monumental was about to happen, though no one could predict exactly what that would be. Judge Albert Cunningham sat at his bench, his hands resting on the stack of files before him. His usually impeccable composure built over decades of experience, had begun to crack. He had read the city's records again. He had reviewed the documents, the notes, the memos, and something was missing. The legal foundation that had once seemed so solid now felt fragile. And then there was Rosa's truth. It couldn't be ignored. He turned his gaze slowly toward the woman who had defied expectations. Rosa Johnson, the frail woman who had walked into his courtroom with nothing but a worn notebook and the courage to speak her truth, sat quietly at the back of the room, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. She looked small, almost fragile, but there was something unyielding in her presence. The years of struggle, the suffering of losing everything, had not broken her. If anything, they had forged her into something stronger than anyone in this room had anticipated. The judge's voice, usually a harsh, commanding force, now carried a softness that startled everyone. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his words slow and deliberate, "I have reviewed the documents and the records. I've spoken with the city's attorneys, and what I found was troubling. There is no official record of an expropriation order for your property. No signed orders, no formal notifications. Nothing that shows the city followed the process it is legally required to follow." A faint gasp rippled through the room. The city's attorney, Andrew Wallace, looked stunned. He had expected this to be a short, simple affair, but now it was something entirely different. He opened his mouth to speak, but Judge Cunningham held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say, Mr. Wallace," the judge said, his voice tinged with finality. "The city acted on an unofficial directive from the mayor, a verbal agreement. But you and I both know that verbal agreements have no place in this court. The law does not bend to convenience or political connections." Andrew's face turned a shade of crimson. He stood rigid, clearly rattled by the unexpected turn of events. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "There are precedents, there are regulations, there are—" "Enough," Cunningham snapped, his tone firm this time. "Your precedents don't apply here. What we have here is an abuse of power, a disregard for due process, for fairness, and, for Mrs. Johnson, the destruction of her home and livelihood." The room was completely still. It was as though every breath had been collectively held. Rosa's hands tightened around the edge of her seat, but she did not speak. She did not move. The moment had arrived. Cunningham turned his gaze to her. His eyes no longer filled with skepticism, but something far deeper respect. Perhaps for the first time in years, he allowed himself to see beyond the law, to see the human side of this case. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper now, "I cannot return your land to you. I cannot undo what has already been done. What the city did to you, what they took from you. I cannot give that back." Rosa felt her breath catch in her chest. A part of her had known this would be the case, that no matter what the judge said, she would never walk out of this courtroom with the land she had lost. But hearing him speak the words so directly, so definitively, brought a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. It was a mixture of grief, resignation, and a strange sense of liberation. At least for once, someone was telling the truth. "But I can do something," Cunningham continued, his voice stronger now. "I can acknowledge the injustice, and I will. I will ensure that your case is made a public precedent, that what was done to you is known. The city will compensate you for the loss of your property, and I will personally ensure that the records are corrected. The city's failure will not go unpunished." Rosa's heart seemed to stop in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her. For a long moment, she didn't know whether to believe it. Her whole life, she had lived with the assumption that the system was broken and it was rigged against people like her. But here, in this room, in this cold, impersonal space, It seemed like something real had finally happened. The truth was finally being acknowledged. Andrew Wallace stood frozen, his jaw clenched tightly. He had expected a different outcome, one in which the city would emerge unscathed, with his victory firmly intact. But this was not the judgment he had been preparing for. The city's lawyers had failed to cover their tracks, and now the entire case hung in the balance. His confidence faltered. For the first time, he could see that the law, as rigid as it was, could be shaken by something as simple and undeniable as Rosa's truth. The room began to stir. Rosa's neighbors, the people who had watched her struggle for years, began to shift in their seats, waiting for the next move. The lawyers, the clerks, even the audience, were all caught in a breathless stillness. The judge continued, his voice reverberating through the room. I will also order that a full investigation be conducted into similar cases to ensure that no other citizen faces the same fate as you did, Mrs. Johnson. Rosa's throat tightened as tears welled up in her eyes. She fought to keep them from falling. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about what the city could give her. It was about something far more precious. It was about justice, long denied, finally being given a voice. Her voice. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling, as she wiped away the tears that had silently fallen down her face. The weight of the years of loneliness, of helplessness, of fighting for something that seemed unattainable pressed on her chest. But in that moment, she felt something shift. Something inside her that had been broken and crushed for so long had finally started to heal. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible as it trembled. Thank you, Your Honor. Cunningham nodded, his face softening for the first time in years. It's not enough, he said quietly. But it's a start. The gavel came down with a final resounding thud. The gavel sound still echoed in Rosa's mind as she sat in the now quiet courtroom. The words that Judge Cunningham had spoken, words that she never expected to hear, resonated in her chest like a drumbeat. The law failed you, Mrs. Johnson. I acknowledge the injustice. The city will compensate you. It was as if the very air in the room had changed, shifted into something more palpable, something that carried with it the weight of justice finally being recognized. Rosa didn't move immediately. She wasn't sure if it was disbelief or the sheer exhaustion of the fight that had kept her rooted to her seat. She looked at the papers in front of her, her notebook, her evidence, her truth, spread out before her like a testament to everything she had endured. These worn pages, these faded words, had become more than just her personal history. They were a symbol of her resistance, her refusal to let the system erase her life. The courtroom, though emptying, still held an energy, a hum in the air. People were leaving, but their eyes lingered, their minds processing what had just unfolded. Many, like Andrew Wallace, still seemed to be processing the shock of the judge's ruling. Wallace, the young, well-dressed assistant city attorney, stood at the back, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his face flushed with frustration and disbelief. He had never expected it to go this way. His job was to defend the city, to win cases, not to witness a blow to its pride. He had underestimated Rosa from the start, dismissing her as a fragile, unimportant old woman who had no place in the legal world. Now, her fight was a thorn in his side that would not be easily removed. Rosa wasn't just some powerless, irrelevant figure. She had taken on the system and had won a victory that could not be erased. Rosa slowly stood up, her legs unsteady as she adjusted her skirt, carefully lifting her worn leather bag. She glanced around the room, her eyes moving from the back of the courtroom, where the city's lawyers had gathered in a tight cluster, to the empty seats. In the silence, she could almost hear the reverberations of everything that had happened, the long years of struggle, the pain of loss, and the rare, fragile moment when something beyond the law was heard. Her pulse still raced in her veins, not from fear, but from something that had come to feel like an epiphany, a recognition that her voice had, in fact, mattered. But just as she began to walk toward the door, something caught her eye. A small movement at the back of the room. She turned her head, and there, standing alone, was the woman who had spoken to her earlier. Rosa had noticed her earlier, but it was only now that she had the chance to truly see her. The woman was older, around Rosa's age, but there was something in her posture, a quiet confidence, the kind that came from having lived through one's own struggles. "Mrs. Johnson?" The woman called softly, stepping forward. Rosa paused, startled by the unexpected attention. The woman's gaze was warm but intense, as though she understood the weight of what Rosa had just experienced. She moved slowly toward Rosa, her face softening as she neared. "You were incredible today," the woman said, her voice gentle but sincere. "I've been following your case from the very beginning, and I never imagined it would go this way. But I'm so glad it did." Rosa blinked, surprised by the stranger's words. She didn't know what to say at first. She had spent so many years alone in this fight, so many years fighting not just the city, but the apathy of others. Yet here was a woman, someone she didn't know, who was offering her genuine gratitude. "Thank you," Rosa managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I didn't know if this was even possible." The woman's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on Rosa's arm. "You made us believe, Mrs. Johnson," she said. "You made all of us believe that. We can still make a difference. We can still stand up for what's right." Tears welled up in Rosa's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like this, with such kindness and genuine respect. Her body trembled slightly, but she steadied herself, refusing to break down. "Not now. Not here," the woman continued, her words carrying weight. "I'm Rebecca. I've lived in the same neighborhood as you for years. I'm a retired teacher, but I've always known about your fight. I never thought the system would let us down like this, but it did. And now, I can't tell you how much your courage means. You've given us all a voice." Rosa's chest tightened. "I didn't do it for anyone else," she said softly. "I just wanted ... I just wanted someone to say I mattered." Rebecca nodded, her expression softening. "You've shown us that we all matter. We all deserve to be heard." Rosa didn't know how to respond. Words felt insufficient for everything she was feeling. She had come into this courtroom prepared for the worst, prepared to be silenced, to walk away with nothing more than a reminder of the world's cruelty. But instead, she had walked out with something she had never expected, the acknowledgement of her humanity, the acknowledgement that her truth had weighed. As the two women stood in the courtroom, their conversation was interrupted by a soft clearing of a throat. Rosa turned her head, startled by the sound. Standing there, just a few steps away, was an older man, a man who had been sitting in the gallery during the trial. He had been one of the quiet ones, the ones who didn't speak much. But now, as he stepped forward, his face was serious, his eyes filled with something akin to reverence. "I just wanted to say something," the man said, his voice gravelly but clear. "I watched your case, Mrs. Johnson, and I've seen what the city has done to people like us. I've lost everything too, my family, my business, everything. And I know what it's like to feel invisible. But today, you made me feel like maybe, just maybe, we aren't invisible after all." Rosa looked at him, stunned by his words. He was just a man, an older man with wrinkles around his eyes and a weathered face, but something in his gaze told her he understood her pain. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice soft but full of empathy. He nodded, his lips, PRESSING together in a tight line. "Thank you," he said, "but I'm not here for pity. I'm here because you gave me hope. You showed me that this system can be broken, that there's still a way to fight. And I think that's something worth fighting for." Rosa felt a lump form in her throat. She had not expected any of this. Not the gratitude, not the recognition, not the sense that her battle had somehow touched more lives than she could have imagined. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. As the man turned to leave, another voice called out, this time from the far side of the courtroom, "I remember that house." A woman said, rising from the audience, "My family used to buy vegetables from you every weekend. I grew up across the street from you. I used to sit on your porch while my mom talked to you. You were there when I was a kid. You were part of our neighborhood." Rosa felt her breath catch. The woman who had spoken was familiar to her. She recognized her face from years ago, from a time when the world seemed simpler, when she had a home, when the garden had flourished. "Of course I remember you," Rosa said, her voice full of warmth. "You were just a little girl back then, running around, always playing in the yard." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I remember you. I remember your garden, the flowers, your tomatoes." She wiped her eyes quickly. "And I remember how you'd always give us a little extra. You didn't have to, but you did. You were part of our community, Mrs. Johnson. You were one of the few people who ever really cared about us." Rosa couldn't speak for a moment. She simply stood there, her heart full of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The room seemed to fill with voices, one by one, people rising from their seats to speak. Each person had a story, a memory of her kindness, her strength, her persistence. And even though the city had taken so much from her, in that moment, she realized that what she had given to others had never truly been taken. It lived on in their words, in their gratitude, in their recognition of her worth. And in that moment, Rosa Johnson understood something profoundly important. Justice wasn't just about the law. It was about the people who fought for it, the people who never stopped believing in it, even when the world had turned its back on them. As the courtroom began to empty, a strange hush lingered in the air, as if the weight of the events that had just transpired hadn't quite settled. The conversations were no longer the usual sterile legal discussions. Now, there were murmurs of admiration, disbelief, and even questions of how this could have happened at all. Judge Cunningham's decision was not something people had expected, least of all from someone as steadfast in his beliefs as him. Rosa stood in the same spot, a gentle tremor in her hands as she adjusted her scarf and took a deep breath. World had been turned upside down. She had entered that courtroom with nothing but a story, and by some miracle, it had been enough to make a judge listen. No one ever listens, she thought, not to someone like me. But now, her name would be etched into the annals of Brooklyn's legal history. Rosa, a voice called, breaking her reverie. She turned to see a familiar face, a middle-aged man, his face wrinkled by years of hard work, stepping toward her. It was Clarence, a neighbor who had known her for years. His voice was soft, yet full of emotion. "Clarence," she greeted him, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't expect to see you here." He shook his head, his eyes intense with emotion. "You've always been a part of this neighborhood, Rosa. I couldn't stay away." Rosa nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had spent so many years keeping to herself, making do with the small plot of land she had left, and yet here was someone who had always known her, someone who had always understood. The thought that others recognized her, not just for what she had lost, but for what she had given, was overwhelming. "I can't believe what happened today," Clarence said, his voice shaking slightly. "They can't take your dignity." "They tried to, but you didn't let them." Rosa's eyes misted over, her voice barely a whisper. "I never had much dignity left, Clarence. It was all taken from me a long time ago. But today, ... Today, I guess I got a little back. Clarence placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. Today, you got more than that. You got a victory. For everyone, a long silence fell between them. Neither of them needed to speak more. They both understood what this meant. What? This fight meant for all the people in the neighborhood who had long been ignored, neglected, discarded by the system. This was not just about Rosa Johnson anymore. This was about everyone who had been silent for too long, who had suffered quietly, without any outlet, without any hope. And now, Rosa had given them that. She had sparked something that could not easily be extinguished. As the conversation quieted, a sudden disturbance broke the moment. The courtroom doors swung open again with force, and two figures entered with the swift energy of people who were used to commanding attention. One was a man in his late 40s, with a sharp, calculating face and a suit that had cost more than Rosa's house had been worth. The other, a tall woman with a crisp, no-nonsense demeanor, walked in with the same air of authority. "Mr. Montalvo," Clarence muttered under his breath, his tone full of disdain. Rosa's heart skipped a beat. Montalvo. He had been the city's top lawyer, the one who had defended its interests, who had brushed aside the lives of people like Rosa. His presence here could only mean one thing. This fight was far from over. Julian Montalvo, the senior attorney for the city, walked toward the judge's bench, his posture rigid. Beside him was his colleague, Claire Sutton, the city's legal advisor. Both of them had an aura of cold professionalism, the kind of people who rarely lost, who knew the game inside and out. They had seen countless cases like Rosa's, and they had always known how to close them, how to bury them before they ever saw the light of day. "Montalvo," Cunningham said, his voice not as firm as it had been during the trial. He was weary. Now, the weight of his decision still fresh in his mind. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," Montalvo replied, his voice smooth, calculating. "I've just reviewed the judgment you issued, and I'm afraid there's been a mistake." Cunningham's eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" Montalvo ignored the judge's tone and continued. "You've issued a ruling based on what I can only describe as incomplete information. There's no formal record of an expropriation fine. I'll admit that. But there's something else you've overlooked, Judge." "What is that?" Cunningham asked, his patience thinning. Claire Sutton stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "The mayor never officially signed off on this case, but there are still legal avenues that could reverse the decision. The city's interest in that land is not something we can ignore. Rosa Johnson is not the only party involved here." Rosa felt a surge of dread coil in her stomach. Not again, she thought. Is this how it's always going to be? Montalvo met her gaze, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I'm afraid the ruling you've made, Judge, could set a dangerous precedent. The city will not allow this kind of legal ... instability." Rosa felt a shiver run down her spine. The fight was far from over. Montalvo and Sutton were not going to just let her win. No, they would use every ounce of their power, their influence, to reverse this. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. The judge shifted in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had made his decision, but Montalvo and Sutton were right. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about power. And the city wasn't going to let a single woman know, matter how resolute, tear down everything they had built. "I will not be intimidated, Montalvo," Cunningham said, his voice low and filled with finality. "This decision stands." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the two lawyers, their faces set in grim determination. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. "I'm not done yet," Montalvo said, his smile tight, calculating, not by a long shot. Rosa's world had changed. There was no denying that. But with the change, a new weight began to settle on her chest, one that she couldn't ignore. In the days after the courtroom ruling, the adrenaline of the victory had worn off, and the reality of what she had just accomplished began to set in. Her victory, although significant, had not been the final word. The city wasn't finished with her. She could feel the storm building on the horizon. The sun had just begun to dip below the skyline of Brooklyn, casting long shadows across her modest apartment. The room felt colder than usual, and Rosa wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders as she sat by the window, staring out into the bustling streets below. The world outside carried on, oblivious to her battle. But she knew it wasn't over. She hadn't heard from Judge Cunningham, not since that fateful day in court. The ruling was clear she had won, at least for the moment. But victory felt like a fleeting ghost in a stormy sea. Rosa's hand rested on her old notebook, the one she had carried with her through all the years of struggle. The pages, filled with her memories, had been her constant companion, even when the world around her seemed to forget she existed. Just as the streetlights flickered on, signaling the night's arrival, Rosa's phone rang, breaking the silence in her small apartment. She picked it up, immediately recognizing the voice on the other end. "Rosa," said Clarence, his voice gruff but urgent. "I just got word from the neighborhood. They filed a motion. The city's appealing your case. They're not going to let it stand. Montalvo's pushing hard for this." Rosa's heart skipped a beat. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. Of course they're appealing, she thought. Of course they're not done with me. They never are not. She had known that. The victory was only temporary, that the system was not built to support people like her. She had fought her whole life against this. But now it was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been told their story didn't matter. She had made a stand, and she couldn't back down now. Clarence continued, his voice tight with concern. "They're saying you've got no right to make that ruling stick. Montalvo's demanding that the decision be reversed. They're coming after you, Rosa. You've got to prepare." "I knew it," Rosa muttered, more too, herself than to Clarence. "I knew they wouldn't just let me walk away with this. They'll stop at nothing." "Don't let them scare you," Clarence urged. "You've got us, the whole neighborhood. We're standing with you. I'm just telling you what's coming down the line. They're not done, and neither should you be." Rosa inhaled deeply, the weight of his words sinking in. She looked down at the notebook in her lap, tracing the worn edges of the pages. The city was relentless, but so was she. She had lived through storms far worse than this storms. Of loss, of grief, of erasure. And now, after all these years, she had something she hadn't had before. The recognition that her life, her story, mattered. But to them, to the people in power, this was just another inconvenience. Another obstacle to remove. They can try. "Clarence," Rosa said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Clarence sighed, a mixture of relief and concern in his voice. "I knew you'd say that. You're tough, Rosa. But remember, the fight's just beginning." After hanging up the phone, Rosa sat in silence for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She had always kept her head down, worked hard, survived. She had never fought for a cause greater than herself. She had never thought it would come to this, fighting not just for her land, but for something bigger, something that could shake the very foundations of the system. And that terrified her. But it also fueled her. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. News outlets began to pick up the story of her legal battle, and soon people started to take notice. It wasn't just the people in her neighborhood who rallied behind her. It was the city at large. Reports began to flood in, each one questioning whether the city had overstepped its bounds. People were finally seeing Rosa for what she was, not a helpless old woman, but a symbol of resistance. Yet, even as the media covered her story, the pressure from the city was mounting. Montalvo's appeal was relentless. He was a master at manipulating the system, at twisting the law to suit his needs. He was a man who had never lost a case, and he wasn't about to start now. Behind closed doors, he was already making phone calls, gathering allies, pushing for a reversal of the ruling. He knew this case could set a precedent. If Rosa's victory stood, it would shake the foundations of city politics and property laws. Montalvo was not going to let that happen. Not under any circumstances. The phone calls started coming in one after another. Most were from people offering support, from reporters wanting interviews, from activists rallying behind Rosa's cause. But there were also ominous calls. Some were vague, others not so much. One was from a lawyer representing a wealthy developer who had been eyeing the land that had once been Rosa's. The message was clear. Get out of this fight while you still can dot it first. Rosa dismissed them. She wasn't afraid of threats. She had lived through worse. But the constant barrage, the mounting pressure, began to wear her down. She could feel it, a quiet but steady erosion of her resolve. It was a reminder of how deeply embedded the system was, how powerful the forces working against her truly were. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, reading through more legal documents, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and she hesitated for a moment before getting up to answer. When she opened it, she found a man standing on her doorstep. He was dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows of the hallway. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said, his voice low and cautious, "but I'm with the city's legal team. We have a proposal for you." Rosa felt her stomach tighten. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "A proposal?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What kind of proposal?" He stepped forward slightly, holding out an envelope. "The city is offering a settlement. You drop the case, and in exchange, you'll receive a financial compensation for the loss of your property. A generous sum. You can go on with your life, no more legal battles." Rosa's heart pounded. She didn't take the envelope. "Is this supposed to intimidate me?" she asked, her voice cold now. The man's expression faltered for just a moment before he quickly regained his composure. "It's a fair offer, ma'am. The city doesn't want to drag this out. It's better for everyone if we resolve this quickly." Rosa took a step back, her eyes hardening. "I don't need your money," she said. "I didn't come here for your handouts. What I want is justice. What I want is for this system to finally hear me." The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her refusal. "Ma'am, I think you're making a mistake." Rosa shook her head. "I've made mistakes in my life, but this won't be one of them. Now leave. And tell your bosses they can't buy me off." The man stood there for a moment, then turned and left, disappearing into the hallway. Rosa slammed the door behind him, her pulse racing. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to be intimidated. She wasn't going to let the city bury her truth. The storm was coming, and she was ready for it. The days stretched out like a taut rope ready to snap. Rosa woke up each morning with the feeling that the weight of the world had accumulated on her shoulders. The city wouldn't leave her alone. Montalvo and his team were relentless, and the appeal to nullify Judge Cunningham's decision had been accepted. The city's lawyers had started making dirty moves, a legal maneuver that, according to them, would tear down everything Rosa had fought for. With each new phone call, Rosa felt the weariness grow. The reporters were more eager for a failure story than a success one. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about a piece of land that had been taken from her. It was a fight for dignity, for being heard in a system that seemed incapable of giving space to people like her. The morning of the hearing for the appeal, Rosa wasn't alone. Her friends from the community, those who knew her well, were by her side. The support circle that had formed around her during the days of her struggle now felt stronger than ever. Still, as she entered the courtroom, she felt the weight of adversity. The rows of lawyers, the city executives, and the politicians there to ensure the case would be overturned seemed imposing. Clarence, who had become one of her biggest supporters, was standing to her left. "It won't stop, Rosa," he whispered urgently, his voice filled with concern. He knew how powerful the enemy was, but he also knew the quiet strength that resided in Rosa. Rosa lifted her head, and with a faint smile, made a gesture of affirmation toward the judge. He looked back at her, his gaze heavy, as if he were fighting his own inner conflict. When the court began, the city's defense was merciless. Montalvo spoke sharply, pointing out every legal flaw in Cunningham's decision, making it clear that Rosa's victory had no solid foundation. He argued that by allowing an unrepresented woman to challenge the city, the judge had put the stability of the legal process and the integrity of public property at risk. Rosa had to wait her turn to speak. When her moment came, she didn't request formal permission. She wasn't there to discuss legal technicalities, but to teach a lesson in humanity. Rosa began to speak calmly, but her words carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle. "I didn't come here to win a legal battle," she began, her voice strong but laced with emotion. "I came here to show that what was done to me wasn't right. This isn't about a piece of land. It's about a system that forgets people. That makes U.S. invisible." She paused and stared directly at the city's lawyers, daring them to say she was wrong. "I don't have a law degree. I don't have a university title. But I still know what is right. And I know what it's like to have something taken from you without even being warned. I'm not here to ask for pity. I'm here to ask for a chance." The courtroom was in complete silence. For a moment, even Montalvo seemed to lose his composure, a fraction of a second in which his eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected a woman with no power to move the pieces of his game the way Rosa had done. The following days were a blur of uncertainty. The court could decide at any moment, and Rosa felt like she was on a tightrope, balancing between hope and fear. The media continued to cover her case, and now it was her job to ensure it wouldn't die in the courts. This fight was too important. The city couldn't win. They couldn't be allowed to silence her. One afternoon, while Rosa was at home, the phone rang. It was a call from the courthouse. She took a deep breath, her stomach tightening, knowing this would be the decisive moment. She had prepared herself to lose everything in a way she already had. But she knew that if she lost, at least she would have fought with everything she had. The court called everyone to the final session. Rosa was accompanied by a small group of people who had become her greatest allies. Clarence was by her side. Again, and once more, she felt the strength that came from the little things. Words, hands extended in support. When Judge Cunningham entered, his face was heavier than ever. He had read the arguments from both sides, but his mind was still in turmoil. The room was tense. The city's lawyers were confident, but there was something in the air, something that made it seem like perhaps the tide was turning. Cunningham finally spoke. "I have made a decision," he said, his voice grave but not as firm as it had been before. "This court, taking into account all the arguments presented and the emotional evidence we are dealing with here, decides that the original decision will stand." There was a moment of absolute silence. The impact of his words reverberated through the entire room. Rosa's breath caught in her chest as the pressure on her chest slowly began to dissipate. She had one. Cunningham continued. I recognize that this case is not simple, and that the law must be applied strictly. But I also recognize that justice is not just a set of rules. Justice is also made of human beings. And in this case, Rosa Johnson, though she may not have all the legal paperwork that the system requires, has something that cannot be ignored: the truth. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the tears to slip down her face. She wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying with relief. Deep, overwhelming relief that only those who have endured pain and struggle can truly feel. The courtroom exploded in murmurs, but Rosa didn't hear anything anymore. The sound was distant. She felt Clarence's hand on her shoulder, and the hands of her community reaching out to her. She had given everything, and justice for once had been done. She lifted her head, eyes shining, and whispered emotionally, "I didn't do this alone. We did this together, all of us." Judge Cunningham, on his part, looked at her with newfound respect, something Rosa knew could never be taken away now.